Welcome to the world of terror. I am Draven Nocturnus, and today I will tell you the chilling story of the Johnson family and the house that whispered. The Johnson family has just moved into an old Victorian mansion on the outskirts of town, attracted by the surprisingly low price and the promise of a fresh start. Parents Mark and Karen, along with their teenage children, Julie and Luke, are excited about the move. However, on the first night, strange whispers echo through the walls, marking the beginning of a week of terror that will test the limits of sanity and family unity. Each night, the paranormal phenomena intensify, revealing the house's dark secrets and challenging the family's reality. Prepare for chills with moments of suspense and terror as you enter the house that whispered. The autumn sun cast long shadows over the imposing facade of the Victorian mansion as the Johnson family arrived, the moving truck creaking in the gravel driveway. Mark, a middle-aged architect with tired but hopeful eyes, was the first to step out of the car, followed by his wife Karen, a writer seeking inspiration. Their teenage children, Julie and Luke, emerged next, their gazes oscillating between excitement and apprehension. The house, with its asymmetrical towers and arched windows, seemed to watch them with sinister curiosity. Painted in faded grey tones with aged white details, it stood out against the orange evening sky. The once well-kept garden was now a maze of overgrown bushes and moss-covered statues. "It's bigger than it looked in the photos," Karen commented, her voice a mix of admiration and a hint of unease. Mark nodded, putting his arm around his wife's shoulders. "And for the price we paid, it's practically a steal. This will be a new beginning for all of us." As the parents began unloading the first boxes, Julie and Luke explored the property. The creak of an old swing in the backyard startled Julie. "Are you sure you want the tower room?" Luke teased his sister. "They say old houses like this are always haunted." Julie rolled her eyes but couldn't suppress a shiver up her spine. "Don't be silly. Ghosts don't exist." As night fell, the family settled into their new rooms. The house seemed to creak and settle around them, as if testing its new inhabitants. The air inside was heavy, laden with the smell of old wood. And something else, something no one could quite identify. It was around midnight when everyone finally lay down, exhausted from the move, that the first whisper was heard, an almost imperceptible sound, like a distant sigh, echoed through the corridors. Karen sat up in bed, frowning. "Did you hear that?" she asked Mark, who was already lightly snoring. In the next room, Luke pulled the blanket up to his chin, his wide eyes fixed on the ceiling. In the tower, Julie curled up in her new bed, suddenly regretting her choice of room. The whisper came again, a little louder this time, as if the house were gaining confidence. It was the beginning of 7 nights that would test the reality, sanity, and family bonds of the Johnsons. For the house they now called home held deep and dark secrets and was just beginning to reveal them. The first ray of sunlight that penetrated the dusty curtains found the Johnson family already awake, each member with pronounced dark circles after a restless night. At the breakfast table, precariously set up among moving boxes, the silence was palpable. Karen was the first to break it. "Did anyone else hear something strange last night?" Julie and Luke exchanged quick glances before fixing their eyes on their cereal. Mark sighed, running a hand through his greying hair. "It must be just the house settling. Old buildings make strange noises." "It wasn't just noises, Dad," Luke murmured. "They sounded like voices." "Whispers," Julie corrected, her voice almost a whisper. Mark frowned, ready to dismiss their concerns, but Karen interrupted him. "Let's take a good look at the house today. Maybe it's just old pipes or wind passing through some crack." The morning was spent unpacking and exploring. The mansion revealed itself to be a labyrinth of rooms, some clearly unused for decades. In the second-floor study, Mark found a collection of old books on the occult, hidden behind a shelf. He quickly skimmed through them before putting them back, an inexplicable discomfort settling in his stomach. In the attic, Julie discovered a locked trunk. Despite her curiosity, something stopped her from trying to open it. The air up there seemed denser, almost oppressive. It was late afternoon when Luke was helping Karen organize the kitchen that something truly disturbing happened. A plate slipped from Karen's hands, but instead of shattering on the floor, it hung in the air for a second before landing softly. "Mum," Luke began, his eyes wide. Karen shook her head, laughing nervously. "It must have hit something. We're all tired, seeing things." As night fell, the tension in the house was palpable. During dinner, forced conversations tried to mask the growing anxiety. No one wanted to admit it, but they all feared the nightfall. Lying in her bed in the tower, Julie stared at the shadows dancing on the ceiling, cast by the branches of the trees outside. Then she heard it, a whisper, clearer than the night before. "Welcome," said the voice, a dry sound like dead leaves in the wind. "You are the chosen ones." Julie stifled a scream, pulling the blanket over her head. In the next room, Luke huddled with his headphones on maximum volume, trying to drown out the sounds that seemed to come from the walls themselves. In the master bedroom, Mark woke to the sound of footsteps in the hallway. He got up to check, but found the corridor empty. When he returned to bed, he noticed Karen was sitting rigidly, staring at the wardrobe mirror. "There's someone there," she whispered. Mark looked, but only saw their own reflections. When he turned to comfort Karen, he noticed with horror that her lips weren't moving, even though the voice continued. "There's someone there, there's someone there, there's someone there." The first night in the house that whispered had ended, but the real terror was just beginning. The second day's breakfast was a silent and tense moment. Deep, dark circles marked the faces of the Johnson family, and nervous glances replaced conversation. It was Mark who finally broke the silence. "Look, I know we're all a little disturbed, but there must be a logical explanation for all this." Karen nodded hesitantly, still shaken by the previous night's events. Maybe it's just the stress of moving." Julie and Luke exchanged skeptical looks, but remained silent. Determined to bring some normalcy to the day, Mark suggested they continue unpacking. "Julie, why don't you finish organizing the attic? Luke, you can help me with the garden." Reluctantly, Julie climbed the creaky stairs to the attic. The light filtering through the circular window illuminated dust particles floating in the air, giving the room an ethereal atmosphere. Her eyes were drawn again to the locked trunk she had found the previous day. Driven by curiosity that outweighed her fear, Julie began to search the dusty shelves for a key. It was then that her fingers touched something cold and metallic behind an old portrait, an ornate old key. With her heart racing, she approached the trunk. The key fit perfectly. With a click, the trunk opened, revealing its contents, a dark, worn, leather-bound diary. Julie opened the diary with trembling hands. The yellowed pages were filled with elegant but disturbing handwriting. As she read, her eyes widened in horror. The diary belonged to a woman named Elizabeth Corvinos, the house's former owner. The entries detailed dark rituals and experiments with the supernatural. The last entry, dated exactly 50 years ago, read, The portal is almost open. We just need one more family. 7 nights, 7 souls. The price for immortality. A sharp scream escaped Julie's lips. Echoing through the house, downstairs Karen dropped a vase, startled by the sound. In the garden, Mark and Luke froze. When the family gathered in the attic, Julie, pale and trembling, showed her discovery. As Mark read aloud excerpts from the diary, the temperature in the room seemed to drop drastically. Suddenly, the attic door slammed, locking them inside. The shadows in the corners seemed to come to life, writhing and stretching towards the terrified family. A voice, the same one Julie had heard the night before, echoed around them. "You have found the truth. Now there is no turning back." In a blink, the shadows retreated, and the door opened again. The Johnson family looked at each other, fear evident in their faces. The revelation of the diary had confirmed their worst fears. The house was not just old, it was malevolent. As they descended the stairs in silence, each family member grappled with their terrifying thoughts. What else did the house hide? And more importantly, how could they escape the fate? Elizabeth Corvinos had planned for them half a century ago. The night was approaching, bringing with it the promise of more horrors. The second night in the house that whispered was about to begin, and with it, new terrors awaited the Johnson family. The morning of the third day arrived, bringing a false sense of normality. The sunlight filtering through the windows seemed to chase away the shadows of the previous night, but it couldn't dispel the fear now deeply lodged in the hearts of the Johnson family. During breakfast, Mark tried to maintain composure. "We need to be rational about this. Maybe it's just an elaborate prank by the previous owner." Karen looked at him skeptically. "A prank that makes doors close by themselves and shadows come to life. There has to be a logical explanation," Mark insisted, more to himself than to the others. Luke, who had been quiet until then, finally spoke. "There's something wrong with my room," so all eyes turned to him. "What do you mean, dear?" Karen asked, concern evident in her voice. Luke swallowed hard before continuing. "Last night, when I went to sleep, my posters were on the north wall. When I woke up, they were on the east wall, and I didn't move them." A heavy silence fell over the table. "It must have been the wind," Mark tried to rationalize, but his voice betrayed his uncertainty. Determined to investigate, the family went up to Luke's room. At first glance, everything seemed normal. But as they examined the room, small differences began to appear. The desk was a few inches out of place. The books on the shelf were in a different order. And more disturbingly, there was now a small mark on the wall that no one remembered seeing before. While everyone was absorbed in examining the changes, the door to the room quietly closed behind them. Julie was the first to notice. "Dad!" she called, her voice trembling. "The door!" Mark turned and tried to open the door, but it wouldn't budge. Then they heard it, a soft dragging sound, as if furniture were being moved. Turning slowly, the family watched in horror as Luke's bed slid a few inches to the left on its own. The posters on the wall fluttered, as if hit by an invisible breeze, and then swapped places before their eyes. Karen stifled a scream, clinging to Mark. Luke and Julie moved closer to their parents, forming a tight group in the center of the room. Suddenly, the lights flickered, and for a brief moment, the room seemed completely different, older, with Victorian furniture and dark wallpaper. Then, in a blink, it returned to normal. The now familiar whispering voice echoed around them. "See how easy it is to change reality? Your concepts of truth are as fragile as the walls of this house." As abruptly as it began, everything stopped. The door clicked open. The Johnson family hurried out of the room, their faces pale with fear. gathered in the living room. They looked at each other, realizing the house wasn't just haunted, it was alive, conscious, and toying with them. "We need to leave," Karen said, her voice barely a whisper. Mark nodded slowly. "Let's pack. We can stay in a hotel until—" He was interrupted by the shrill ring of the phone. Everyone froze. Slowly Mark answered. "Hello," he said hesitantly. The voice on the other end was familiar, but distorted, as if coming from far away or long ago. "It's no use running." The day dawned gloomy, with heavy clouds and an air of an impending storm enveloping the mansion. The Johnson family, exhausted and scared, had barely slept after the events of the previous night. Breakfast was silent, the tension hanging in the air like an invisible presence. Mark tried to maintain rationality, but his eyes betrayed a growing sense of helplessness. Karen was lost in thought, her face pale and worried. Julie and Luke avoided looking at each other, both feeling that something worse was coming. It was in the afternoon that Karen had the idea of covering the mirrors in the house, an old practice to ward off spirits according to vaguely remembered legends. With old cloths she began covering the mirrors, but one in the bathroom was too large, and there weren't enough cloths. As the sun began to set, the family gathered in the living room. Suddenly, a metallic sound echoed down the hall. Karen, feeling an inexplicable urgency, went to the bathroom. She stopped in front of the large mirror she couldn't cover. Her eyes widened as she saw that the reflection did not follow her movements correctly. There was a 1-second delay, as if a version of her was trapped on the other side, slightly out of sync. "Mark, come here quickly," Karen screamed, her voice trembling. Mark arrived hurriedly, followed by Julie and Luke. They watched in horror as Karen's reflection continued to move even when she stood still. Suddenly, a shadowy figure appeared behind her in the mirror, though the bathroom was empty. The figure seemed to be a tall man, shrouded in shadows, with glowing eyes emanating intense malevolence. Karen quickly turned around but saw no one there. When she looked back at the mirror, the figure had disappeared, but the fear lingered. "We can't go on like this," Mark said, his voice tense. "We need to find a way to end this." Julie and Luke began to question their own perception of reality. Every shadow seemed to move. Every sound seemed to have a sinister meaning. The house was playing with their minds, distorting what they considered real. As night progressed, the family began to hear whispers again, but this time they seemed to come from inside their own heads. The bathroom mirror continued to display distorted and delayed reflections, becoming a portal to their worst fears. In summary, the fourth night in the Victorian mansion brought a new layer of psychological terror, where even one's own reflection became an enemy. Karen stayed awake all night, afraid to close her eyes and encounter that shadowy figure again. Mark tried to remain calm, but the feeling of being watched never left him. Julie and Luke, each in their rooms, couldn't close their eyes, fearing what might hide in the darkness. The Johnsons were on the brink of collapse, their minds thrown into a whirlwind of fear and paranoia. The house seemed to feed on their insecurities, growing stronger each night. They knew that the true horror was yet to come, but how could they face it when even their own reflections became a threat? The fifth morning at the mansion was marked by an oppressive sense of fear and despair. The sky was covered with dark clouds, reflecting the Johnson family's state of mind. They knew something terrible awaited them, but were unsure how to face it. Mark, determined to find a solution, decided to investigate the noises coming from the basement. He grabbed a flashlight and, with Karen by his side, descended the creaky wooden steps. Julie and Luke stayed in the kitchen, their eyes following every movement of their parents, their hearts pounding. The basement was a dark and damp place, full of old boxes and dust-covered furniture. Mark's flashlight beam danced across the stone walls, revealing strange symbols carved into the surface. Mark felt a chill run down his spine as he recognized some of the symbols from the occult books he had found in the study. "Karen, look at this," he whispered, pointing to the symbols. "This isn't normal." Karen nodded, her eyes wide. "We need to find out what they mean. Maybe they'll explain what's happening." At the back of the basement, Mark found a dust-covered altar with half-burned black candles around it. In the center was an old book, its pages yellowed and worn. Mark opened it carefully, revealing instructions for an ancient ritual that seemed to be an attempt to open a portal to another dimension. "Mark, I don't think we should mess with this," Karen warned, but her husband was already flipping through the pages, fascinated and horrified at the same time. Suddenly, a cold wind swept through the basement, extinguishing the flashlight. Karen screamed, clinging to Mark as he tried to relight it. When the flashlight finally worked again, they saw something that made them freeze in fear. A thin black mist began to form around the altar. "We need to get out of here now," Mark shouted, pulling Karen towards the stairs, but before they could reach the exit, the black mist condensed, forming a pulsating vortex at the center of the basement. The whispering voice echoed around them, stronger and clearer than ever. "You have opened the door. Now face what comes from the other side." Mark and Karen ran out of the basement, locking the door behind them. They stumbled up the stairs, finding Julie and Luke waiting for them, pale with fear. "What happened?" Julie asked, her voice trembling. Mark struggled to find words. We opened something that shouldn't have been opened." That night, the mansion was in complete silence, but the tension was palpable. Every family member was on high alert, expecting the worst. The whispers started again, but this time they were accompanied by heavy footsteps and scratching on the walls. As the night wore on, the house began to change again. The shadows on the walls became denser and started to move, taking humanoid forms. Shadowy creatures emerged from the walls, their eyes glowing with an indescribable malevolence. The Johnson family huddled together in the living room, trying to protect each other. Mark held a knife while Karen clutched Julie and Luke, trying to stay calm. "We need to find a way to close the portal," Mark said, his voice firm despite the fear. Karen nodded, her eyes filled with determination. "We need to fight, for our family." Darkness enveloped the mansion like a suffocating shroud, and the Johnson family prepared to face the most terrifying night of their lives. The shadows on the walls gained form and substance, materializing into grotesque and malevolent creatures. The tension was palpable, every breath filled with fear. The first attacks came from the hallway. Shadowy creatures with glowing eyes and distorted forms advanced slowly, emitting guttural sounds that sent shivers down the spine. Mark, wielding a knife, positioned himself in front of the family, determined to protect them at any cost. "Stay behind me," he ordered, his voice firm despite the terror in his eyes. Karen clung to Julie and Luke, trying to remain calm. The children, pale and trembling, looked at their father with a mix of hope and despair. When the first creature approached, Mark struck with all his might. The knife sliced through the shadow, which dissipated into a black mist, but others took its place, advancing with growing fury. The family fought with all their strength, using anything they could find as improvised weapons. Mark, Karen, Julie, and Luke were in constant motion, trying to avoid the sharp claws and glowing eyes of the creatures. Terror and adrenaline kept them standing, but fatigue began to set in. "We can't keep this up all night," Karen said, breathless. "We need a plan." Mark, sweating and bleeding from small cuts, nodded. "We need to find the connection between these shadows and the house's past. There must be a way to stop this." It was Julie who made the discovery. In a moment of calm, she remembered Elizabeth Corvinos's diary she had found in the attic. "The diary. We need to read more about the rituals. There must be something that explains how to stop this." The family gathered in the living room, surrounded by the shadows that moved restlessly around them. With trembling hands, Julie flipped through the diary, reading aloud the passages about the rituals. The ancient and enigmatic words began to make sense. The portal was opened so the souls of the former inhabitants could return, Julie explained, her voice broken by fear. "But there is a way to close it. We need to perform a banishment ritual." Mark took the diary from Julie's hands, reading the instructions. "We need candles, salt, and blood. Our blood." Karen hesitated, but then looked at her children. "We'll do whatever it takes to protect our family." The family worked together, gathering the necessary items. The shadowy creatures watched them, as if they knew what they were planning. The tension was unbearable. Every second felt like an eternity. With the candles lit and a circle of salt around them, Mark, Karen, Julie, and Luke stood in the center of the living room. Mark read the ritual's words aloud, and the house's atmosphere changed immediately. The shadows began to retreat, as if feeling the power of the ancient words. As they performed the ritual, visions of the past began to appear. The family saw Elizabeth Corvinos and her followers performing dark rituals, opening the portal that now threatened the Johnsons' lives. They saw the horrors the house had witnessed, the tormented souls seeking revenge. The truth about the house's curse was revealed. Elizabeth had sacrificed entire families to achieve immortality, and the Johnsons were just the latest victims. The banishment ritual was their only hope to stop the cycle of terror. As the ritual neared its end, the shadows began to disappear one by one, dissipating into the air. The house seemed to breathe a sigh of relief, the walls relaxing and the whispers ceasing. Mark, exhausted, dropped the diary to the floor. "We did it, at least for now." Karen hugged her children, tears of relief streaming down her face. "We need to get out of here. Now." The sixth night in the Victorian mansion had ended, but the Johnson family knew that the true confrontation was still to come. They had discovered the truth about the house, but now they needed to find a way to destroy the curse once and for all. The seventh morning brought a tense calm to the mansion. The Johnson family was exhausted, both physically and emotionally, but determined to end the terror that plagued them. They knew that the next night would be decisive. Mark, Karen, Julie, and Luke gathered in the kitchen, discussing their next step. Elizabeth Corvinos' diary mentioned a final ritual, one that could destroy the curse forever, but it was risky and required a sacrifice. "We have to do this," Mark said, determined. "We can't let this curse continue. If we don't do something, another family will end up here, suffering like us." Karen, though terrified, agreed. "We need to protect each other. We'll do whatever it takes." Julie and Luke spent the morning researching old books and the internet, trying to find more details about the ritual. They discovered that the ritual had to be performed exactly at midnight in the house's center, and required the union of all family members. "We have to prepare," Julie said, closing an old book with a sigh. "We can't fail." As the day progressed, the tension increased. The house was restless, as if it knew something was about to happen. The air was charged with electricity, and every sound seemed amplified. When night fell, the family gathered in the living room. Mark lit the candles, forming a circle around them. The diary lay open on the floor, and each family member held a personal object necessary for the ritual. As the clock struck midnight, they began to recite the ancient words. The room's temperature dropped drastically, and the shadows began to writhe on the walls. The malevolent entity manifested, a shadowy figure with glowing eyes and an oppressive presence. "You cannot defeat me," the entity whispered, its voice reverberating through the room. "I am eternal. You are merely mortals." Each family member was confronted with visions of their greatest fears. Mark saw himself failing to protect his family. Karen faced loneliness and despair. Julie saw the loss of her identity, and Luke faced the death of his loved ones. But despite the fear, they continued the ritual, their voices firm and united. The entity tried to interrupt them, but the strength of their union was more powerful. With one last effort, the family recited the ritual's final line. The room filled with a bright light, and the entity let out a scream of rage and pain before dissipating into the air. The house shook, as if in agony, but then everything went silent. The shadows disappeared, and the temperature returned to normal. The curse had been broken. The Johnson family stood in the center of the room, panting, but relieved. They knew they had to decide what to do next. "We can't stay here," Mark finally said. "This house isn't safe. We need to leave." Karen, Julie, and Luke agreed. Although the curse had been broken, the Victorian mansion held too many memories of terror and suffering. It was time to find a new beginning elsewhere. The consequences, the family's fate after the events. The Johnsons moved to a new home far from the Victorian mansion. The experience changed them, but also strengthened their bonds. Each found a way to deal with the trauma, supporting each other. The legacy of the Whispering House. The Victorian mansion remained empty, its arched windows silently observing the passage of time. But even without the Johnson family's presence, stories about the mysterious events and sinister whispers continued to circulate through the town, becoming part of local legend. Reflections on the price of a new beginning. The family reflected on the price they paid for their new beginning. They learned that sometimes what seems like a good deal can hide terrible secrets. But above all, they discovered the importance of unity and courage in the face of the unknown. The Johnsons moved forward, their lives transformed, but confident that together they could face anything. And so ends The 7 Nights of Inexplicable Terror, a story of fear, struggle, and survival in the house that whispered. The story of the Johnson family is just one among many. Around every corner, in every town, there are houses with dark secrets waiting to be discovered. Stay tuned for the next tale by Draven Nocturnus, where new horrors and mysteries await those brave enough to face them. Until the next night of terror,